many of you, the scriptures that you hear Sabbath after Sabbath, you've heard them before. And what I want to invite you to do is to listen as if for the first time. We've already made up our opinions, our minds on what the stories are often all about. But today, in listening to these two sort of miraculous accounts of Jesus living in relationship with God, the world, and the needs of the world, these stories, I think, invite you and me into a new understanding of the power of a miracle and the trouble with miracles. This is what the author of the Gospel of John wrote. A little later, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great multitude followed him, because they had seen signs which he did on those who were diseased. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now it was the Passover, the feast of the Jews. It was at hand. And lifting up his eyes, he saw a great multitude coming toward him. Jesus turned to Philip and said, "How are we to buy bread so that all these people may eat?" He said this to test Philip, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered, "Well, 200 denarii wouldn't buy enough bread for each of them even to get just a little." One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a lad here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many?" And Jesus said, "Well, make the people sit down." There was a lot of grass in that place. So the people sat down. In number, there were about 5,000 people. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as anyone wanted. And when they'd all eaten their fill, he told the disciples, "You gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from 5 barley loaves, left over by those who had already eaten. When the people saw the sign which he'd done, they said, "Now this is indeed a prophet, and he's come into this world." Perceiving that they were about to come, take him by force, and try to make him king, he withdrew again to a mountain, this time by himself. When evening came, his disciples had already gone down to the sea. They got into a boat, and they started across the sea to Capernaum. It was dark, and Jesus hadn't yet come to them. The sea rose because of strong winds blowing. When they rowed about 3-4 miles away, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat. They were frightened. But he said to them, "It's I. Don't be afraid." And they were very glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Our sanctuary here holds 500, close to 600 people, with full lower sanctuary area and balcony. But that's nowhere near 5,000. Can you imagine? I mean, would it be a good thing if on one Sunday morning 5,000 people showed up here for worship? Yeah, let me tell you how it would go. And then, so one of us got a message. Keith, you got the message, and you told me, saying, God had said to you, we need to feed those 5,000 people. And then I announced that to Wayne Detweiler, the chair of the trustees. And he would say to me, "You think we need a food distribution license?" And the 2 Jamies, the Lovings, they'd be standing back there and they'd be stroking their faces like this, and Jamie would say, "The cost of this, is this a one-time thing, or do we need to put this in the annual budget?" And outreach, poor Eileen would say, "I don't have 5,000 registration of attendance cards." poor old William Lou, he would stand up, chair of Church and Society, and he would say, "Is this replacing Martha's table?" Education, Keith Lee and Melissa Harris. "We're very concerned, Pastor, about the teacher-student ratio." And then there's the worship. Gail back there, she'd say, I don't really think we should pass the peace today. And besides, we don't have enough hand sanitizer for this crowd. And the music department, they would say, "Okay, we get it. We want to sing, but hey, it's the summer, right? And we've got 5 or 6 voices up here. We don't even know where to stand so that all of these people can hear us." That would be if we had such a challenge. But back in Jesus' day, there were trouble with miracles. And the trouble with miracles is that all too often, for us modern pastors, people will say, "Jim, do you still believe God works miracles?" And here's where we have to parse some words. We get into definition struggle just a little bit. Because this word for miracle that's used in the Greek New Testament, dunamis, it literally means power. A miracle is a work of power. It's not magic. It's not the suspending of the laws of nature or of physics to accomplish this. It's just simply something wonderful occurred and it has a powerful effect on people. Now, we're all post-Enlightenment. I mean, some of us are sort of Jeffersonian in that tradition, if we're not Hokies. And God bless both those wonderful schools. But old Jefferson, anytime he found a miracle passage in the New Testament, took a pair of scissors to it. And he just cut it out. I understand that. What he really wanted to do was to take the New Testament, the Gospels, and challenge himself to be faithful simply to the teachings of Jesus, his sayings, and the way he chose to live. He didn't want to be distracted by things that it would be very difficult for him to explain as a child of enlightenment. But I've got this robe on, and if I were a first century person, and I had decided I'm going to go follow Jesus, inside this robe that I would have been wearing, there were these fairly large pockets. And in those pockets, I would have put a skin. And in that skin, I could have put water, but I also could have put wine. On the other pocket, because there's no McDonald's, there's no McLean family restaurant for us to make a pit stop and feed, I would have carried bread with me as well. And some persons may have said, well, there's an explanation for all this. Those 5,000 people that showed up, they didn't come empty-handed. They brought with them the things that they would have needed to have made that journey just to see Jesus. You've got to have with you enough to get there and also enough to get back. And what I want you and me to do is to sort of step away from arguments like that and just say, we don't really need to explain these miracle stories that way. I think the real miracle of that story is not so much that you and I have to explain where the food came from to feed 5,000 people. I think the work of power was that in Jesus' day, given a people who were completely under the thumb of a Roman occupying army and living in fear, could find in the words and the deeds of this man so much hope for their future that they would come to reinvest in life in ways that would be filled with power and wonder, simply because he gathered them all up together and he recognized the conditions under which they were living. And surely they were fed with bread. But I think the real miracle is that they began to realize that the words from this man who would empower them and set them free the rest of their lives was feeding them the bread of life itself. You know the difference between simply being alive and having a life. And what he was offering them was not existence another day yet of daily bread, which is important. He was offering them a reason for their lives, something in which they would feast in their souls and they would grow strong in their faith. He also did a lot of miracles with respect to healing of people. And probably it's those kinds of works of power that brought out so many people to see him in the first place. I doubt they were coming up for snacks and for some bread, a little water, wine. I don't really think that's the motivation. I think they were coming not only to hear him, but I think they were also coming to be healed of any illness that they may bring themselves or in a friend that they were escorting, to see this man whose words had the power to heal and restore. When I was a kid, there were not a lot of vaccinations. Our parents, when the kid or so next door got the measles or the mumps or the chicken pox, they made sure we were all exposed. They just wanted us to get those childhood diseases out of the way and get them out of the way quickly, because growing up in the 40s and 50s, there was no guarantee that a child would have a long lifespan. This is in the time where you didn't get shots for, DPT. You didn't get those things that would make your life a little more pleasant as a parent and a lot less miserable as a child. And one of the biggest fears that we had in my generation, I was scared to death of that iron lung. You ever seen pictures of the iron lung? Kids in that. Diane McCulloch, who comes to our 8:30 worship service, she was a nurse who took care of children in iron lungs. When I was in late kindergarten, maybe first year of elementary school, something like that, the polio vaccination came out. And my dad said, "Hey, don't worry about everybody else getting that shot." He said, "Go on up there and be the first one. You can get it all over with, and you can watch everybody else cry." And I thought, that's good advice. So I did. I got the first polio shot in Charlottesville, Virginia. I was a proud dude. But I think that's what Jesus meant when someone was responding to some of those works of power when he healed people. And they were remarking about how wonderful that was and how much it meant to them. And he said, greater things than this you will see. And I think what he was doing was looking right past your left ear, over your shoulder, not at you, but at generations that would come centuries and centuries later. I think he was speaking to you, but I think he was also speaking to people who are going to come just as you have, generation after generation, reminding us in each of our times and places that great things can be accomplished with us and through us and by us, because we expect the miraculous, powerful works that can happen through the likes of you and me in our time and in our place. We just have to expect it from God. And the trouble with miracles today is that you and I have grown too sophisticated for it. And the miracles of the first century are far too subtle for us. Then you have Jesus walking on the water. It's night. The apostles are already in a little boat. They're 2 or 3 miles out. They see him coming on the water. And have you ever wondered, as a child of the Enlightenment, as a scientific type, how do you do that? I mean, how do you really skirt across the surface of the water? Pastors have jokes about that. Most of us say, well, you knew where the sandbar was. Or you knew where the rocks were. But the funky thing about this Greek language, this epi, the word that can be translated walking on the water, can also mean walking by the water. Which one did the writer, did the author mean? Was he walking by the water or walking on it? I don't think the author was trying to suggest to you and me that all you're supposed to do is just step out of a boat in the middle of the ocean and try to walk across it, expecting to be able to do it. I think what the story's all about is, once again, that miracle, I believe, is so subtle. It's saying to us that when Jesus speaks to you and me, we'll take steps in places where ordinarily we'd be afraid to do it. Most of us would be afraid to step out of a ship and onto the water. That makes perfectly good sense. But if you understand that miracle in a more subtle way, how many times in our lives does Jesus invite you and me to take a journey where you've never been before and you're antsy about it? You're afraid. Or you think it's impossible, we'll never be able to do this or pull that off. But the power of the miracles in John is that when Jesus invites you to do it, he's already got the energy and the resources for you and me to make it a work of power, a reality. And I think for us modern times, the real challenge for us is to get beyond any of the trouble that we have with miracles. You don't have to explain them. Take a deeper dive. Don't look just on the surface of the water to see who's gliding, who's skimming. Ask yourself, what was that really about? Trust, confidence, daring, the ability with God to make all things possible and to use you to do it. I think maybe the best way to sort of sum this up is in the words of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I think she's got the idea best. This is what she wrote. The earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush is afire with God. And only the ones who see it take their shoes off. I invite you, sisters, brothers in Christ, expect things from God and expect God to use you to get them accomplished. And when you recognize that you're in the place of one of these bushes that's afire, don't ask yourself, how is that happening? Just take your shoes off. Snuggle up close to its warmth. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.